and economic equality in our city. So the name of our session is Community Action in the Time of Crisis, the Impact of Racial Inequality in Detroit. And I welcome all of you as participants, and I look forward to this dialogue. We will be recording the event to be able to put it onto our website so that others can listen if they weren't able to make this time today. We have with us today 3 panelists who are going to share their perspectives on both what the current situation is in this country and to provide some historical context, what their experiences have been in the past and how that helps shape not only where we've been, but where we're going. And the third area is what action can we take? What should we do? So we're going to break this presentation up by speaker and by topic area, and we'll alternate between them as we go through. I'm going to introduce them, and then I'm going to introduce our facilitator, and hope that they are both already on the line. I haven't seen their names yet, but we're going to hope that they're there. Victoria Burton Harris, could you please say something so your picture comes to the forefront of everyone's screen?
Good morning, Dr. Kubiak. Thanks so much for having me as a panelist. I'm happy to be here. I'm honored to be here.
Thank you for being here. Those of you who don't know Victoria Burton Harris soon will. She is a criminal defense attorney who is running for Wayne County prosecutor. Victoria believes that we can build a safe and just community using restorative justice practices in collaboration with community partners. As a member of the National Lawyers Guild and National Conference of Black Lawyers, she has represented countless protesters engaged in denouncing racial injustice and police brutality. She is a founder of the McCaskey Law and, as I said, a current candidate for the Wayne County prosecutor. And please go to her website if you'd like to learn more. Mr. Paul Hubbard. Paul, do you want to say something so you can come to the front?
Yes, I'm here, and I want to thank you and the School of Social Work for putting this on. And probably this is going to be one of the more enlightening and fruitful discussions that will happen on campus.
Yes. Well, I agree. Paul Hubbard has spent over 20 years. I was the president of New Detroit. And for those of you who are in my age bracket, you know that New Detroit was formed in response to the 1967 rebellion. While he was obtaining his MSW from Wayne State, Mr. Hubbard also organized and led the Association of Black Social Worker Student Organization. He's committed to providing expertise to local organizations and has served as a board member for numerous organizations, including the National Urban League, the National Association of Black Social Workers, Grand Valley University, and Mary Grove College. At the present, Mr. Hubbard co-chairs the Toledo Social Unrest Task Force focused on COVID-19 and its effects on the African American community. He also serves as a member of our Social Work Board of Visitors. Santil Jenkins. Santil, could you say something? Santil? Okay. I am going to introduce her just with the hope that she's going to be a few minutes late, and she will be on. But Santil Jenkins is a lifelong Detroiter, and she currently serves as the CEO of the Heat and Warmth Fund, or THAW, a nonprofit organization that provides energy assistance to Michigan residents in need. Prior to her role at THAW, Jenkins served as a member of the Detroit City Council. She's been an advocate for public service and civic involvement, and she's served on a number of boards that have impact on city government, the city's quality of life, and Detroit's future. She received her BSW and MSW programs from Wayne State and also sits on our board of visitors. Is Lloyd Allen on the phone? or on the Zoom call. Okay, Lloyd is a faculty member within the School of Social Work. Lloyd, could you say something so that your face can pop up so people know who you are?
Hi, my name is J. Lloyd Allen. I am assistant professor in the School of Social Work here at Wayne State University.
And Lloyd was going to be the moderator for today's discussion and keep it on track. And while he's doing that, I mean, I would just say that Lloyd's been a wonderful leader in the School of Social Work, and his work, his research interests are the exploration of issues around community mobilization, mental health, and Black African American gay men, gender and sexuality, HIV policy, and advocacy. We're really happy to have Lloyd here to facilitate the discussion, and I will let him get started with that. And as I said, if you have comments or questions, please type them into the chat room, and Anwar and I will monitor that. So, Lloyd?
Hi
Please.
all. How are you all doing? I know this is, first of all, I want to thank Dean Kubiak for facilitating this discussion with us. I also want to thank our esteemed panelists for sharing their insights. We are in a time when things are awry. The last couple of days, I've had to take some personal days to unpack, and I just had to take some time away from social media, from the news, from everything, because I was hurt. I don't know how to essentially process some of my feelings. Being a Black man, being someone who's educated, you know, working hard, getting to where I'm at, you know, going out is even scary for me. So I want to thank the panelists, and I hope that we have some very fruitful discussions around what is happening, steps that we can take in order to decrease, you know, racial violence, racial inequality with us today. So we're going to turn it over to our first panelist, and we're going to open up the floor for discussion.
So why don't we start with Paul and talking about your appraisal of the current situation.
Okay, again, I'd like to thank you for hosting this. And it's, you know, as I thought about it, it's quite eventful, and it's also appropriate that we talk about social work. One of the things before I get into a regular presentation that I would just like to say is I've noticed that the word social, we talk about social distancing, social unrest, social justice, social injustice. And so this really means that social is on everybody's mind when we look at those particular terms. What I want to do is first talk about how this is almost history repeating itself. In 1967, when the riots went all over the country, there was a lot of people talking, there was a lot of news media. And as the dean says, I'm on the mayor's task force here for racial injustice, which is basically racial unrest. And as I said in some of the meetings and listened to some of the young people speak, and they were very articulate, and a lot of them were college graduates too, school teachers and all, the words were almost identical to what was going on back in 1967. So what I would like to do is first just take a few minutes and go through some bullet phrases that we're hearing all the time that are almost verbatim of what was said in 1967. Right-wing people are only comfortable with peaceful protests, even though there's violence that's caused the protests. Everyone is looting, is not just African Americans. Right-wing people are putting property over lives as far as value. Right-wing people are changing the focus off of social justice by making it seem like outsiders are creating the problem and making outsiders the main focus, when we know that 90-some% of the people protesting are there for right reasons and are really not creating a problem. When we, you know, address the problems of protest and what's out there, why don't we also, not we, but why don't they also take a look at what wrong things happen to put people out there for the protests? People all over the world is demonstrating. So this shows that people all over the world is fed up with social injustice. Good example of one that was right before the protest is how the virus is affecting Black folks, the Black community, and Hispanic people. And it's basically because one, we have poor housing where we have to be crowded in with each other. There's not recreation, there's not healthcare. Most of the healthcare for low income is the emergency ward when they are ill. And so the virus itself shows social injustice. One of the other things is that the forefathers of our country, George Washington, who everybody reveres, was a slave owner. The writers of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence were slave owners, and they were the forefathers of our country. One good thing that I think is going to come out of this, and this is very important, is this may be the start of the end of the police fraternity. There is a police fraternity, and I will get into that in a second. And that is basically what causes most of the problems we have. But when we saw the sheriff in Flint walking with the protesters, New York police taking a knee, the Minnesota police chief who says all four were guilty, the Toledo police chief, when they marched to his house, he came out of the house and marched to a press conference with them hand in hand. And also the firefighter in Toledo, who was Black, tweeted of how he's supporting of the protesters and how he's afraid of what police would do to his son. Now, when I talk about that police fraternity, when I came to Toledo as Director of Economic Development, Director of Neighborhoods, Jerry Galvin came in as a new police chief. And Gary and I had a lot of discussions together. And I said, well, Gary, you know, in recruiting Black officers, Hispanic officers, and female officers, shouldn't that help the problem? And he said, no, the fraternity has a way to get to them. I said, what do you mean? He says, as they are rookies, they'll go out to do a drug bust, or they'll do a traffic stop. And then all of a sudden, the cops will step aside and let the person in the place where they're doing a drug bust come up with a baseball bat and start swinging or start shooting. And then when they get back to the police station, the police would say, well, you know, if you was a member of our fraternity, we would have your back. And so right there, he was saying that a lot of the Black officers, Hispanic officers, and female officers have a choice of quitting or joining the fraternity. He said by then they have bought a house, they bought cars, they have started living a pretty good life, so they can't give up the economic response. So that fraternity was live and well. So what I really see here is this is probably the beginning of that fraternity breaking up. Media and elected officials have been pepper sprayed, rubber bullets. A good example, though, of how the protest helps and how working together helps is when I was at Wayne State in grad school, I was president of the Association of Black Students, both the Black social work students, but also the whole campus Association of Black Students. There were, and some on here that's got gray hair like me will remember, but I know those others don't, because I talked to a group of leadership people at Wayne State, and they did not remember the Kent State incident where white students, well, everybody was protesting the war, and National Guards came in and literally shot up over 100 and some students. Most of them were white. Many died, and that was the Kent State incident. People all over the country were really, really mad. And then about 6 months later, this highway patrol shot up Jackson State in Mississippi, which was a Black school. And 9 kids were shot and killed there, and there was really no uproar or uprise around the campus of the country. So as president of Association of Students, we decided that we needed to shut the campus down to bring just as much attention to the killing of the Black students at Jackson State as there was to white students at Kent State. I got a call one night from President Keese, who was president then. He says, "Paul, I understand you're gonna shut down my campus." I said, "Yes." He says, "Would you meet me in my apartment," which is the one that all the presidents use, at 6 o'clock in the morning, "and I'll serve you breakfast." And I want it to be 6 because my colleagues don't need to see me meeting with you, and your colleagues don't need to see you meeting with me, the white president of the university. So when I got to his apartment on campus at 6 in the morning, the first thing he says, "Are you still gonna shut my campus down?" I said, "Yes." So next thing I'm looking to be cussed out or chewed out, he says, "Well, would you like me to help you?" I said, "Sure, President. How are you gonna help me to do it?" He says, "Well, when you shut the campus down, why don't you call for something called a teach-in?" He says, "Because the professors here at Wayne State University, half of them are kind of racist. Most of them don't want to give African Americans the credit that they have actually contributed to curriculum and things going on as a country." He says, "So I would like to get my math teachers, my science teachers, English teachers to spend 2 weeks teaching what African Americans have contributed to those different categories of learning." I said, "That sounds right." So when I got on the mall and we headed down, I called for to shut down the campus and everybody said, fine. And I said, however, we're going to have a teach-in where we're asking all professors to teach for the next 2 weeks what Blacks have contributed to this country in their particular areas. That went over. President Keese got written up in Time magazine and everywhere else for being one of the better progressive college presidents because he worked with the students. Of course, the fallout for me was the FBI got on me then, but thanks to Marianne Mahaffey, Coleman Young, and Les Roberts, who was a professor there then, they helped me through that. And so, but that's an example of how working together with institutions, we can then begin to change things. A lot of people say we need to vote, and we do need to vote, but one of our problems about voting is we don't hold people accountable. We put them in office, and then we don't hold them accountable. And a lot of times they want to be held accountable. One of the biggest arguments that I had, and a lot of my friends know it, was that when Barack Obama was president, I used to say we need to put some pressure on him about Black unemployment, about Black businesses, about social work and things like that. And people would get furious with me, particularly women. Black women loved the way he walked, and they loved Michelle and how he treated her. And it was like he could do any wrong. And I used to say, yeah, but he needs pressure from us. He needs to be able to say, I got 1 million letters or 1 million phone calls on Black unemployment or on Black businesses, et cetera. And I said, without that kind of pressure, he doesn't really have a hat to hold on. So all I'm saying is, yeah, we need to vote and put people in office, but we also need to hold them accountability once they get into office to give them leverage also. We need to make sure that the virus gets, the vaccine for the virus gets to poor people. Everybody I talked to in the health field, including my son, who's chief of staff at Detroit Health Connection, says that around the fall, the vaccine will be there. Now, what we have to make sure is that the people that we serve as social workers get the vaccine just as quick as other people do. Right now, there's $1 billion that is being set aside for vaccine distribution. 500 million is being set aside for low-income people distribution. I would say that we need to start talking to our politicians in Michigan about that now. I was on a conference call yesterday with Congresswoman Rashid, and there was a lot of other people on there talking about this. And a lot of people are already gearing up to get that $500 million for distribution. And I'm saying as social workers, we need to figure out how we're getting that money to low-income people in order to be able to get the vaccine needed. President Wilson was on that call with us also, and he is also working on making sure that that vaccine gets to poor people also. Many police officers don't live in Detroit. And, you know, as we talk about outsiders coming into March, we also should be talking about police officers that don't live in Detroit. We also have to remember that many of the protests at the state capitol that was against the governor don't live in Lansing. Detroit spends hundreds of millions of dollars on police and not nearly that much on housing, healthcare, youth, recreation, etc. One of the other things that's out that's good is that LeBron James, Aaron Rodgers is calling out Drew Brees, and so that gets to a lot of the people that are in athlete. And the thing that Drew Brees has talked about is that his grandfather and great grandfather were American citizens fought in the war. But when you start talking about great grandfathers, you know, we're going back to before integration. We also talking about slavery. As Obama said in his broadcast the other day, mayors need to review police policies, and this is something that social workers need to begin to push, is partnerships with the police department. We need to push getting personality audits to see where ethnic biases are. One of the things that was said in the Zoom meeting yesterday, that Denzel Washington was out in Hollywood and saw police stopping a black person. He got out of his car and went to the person, told him to put the hands up, to find out that the person basically had no health problem. He took the person and put him in his car and took him for treatment. But that right there goes to show how social workers and mental health people need to be involved with the police department, because a lot of people out there have mental health problems. Again, the words social distancing, social unrest, social justice, social injustice. So the day has come that we need to be involved. Now, to begin to talk about some of the past that we need to be talking about, let me just name a few words out here. Black Panther Party, you know, they were very involved in where they got a bad rap from the right wing. They had the breakfast program, lunch programs where they fed kids. We had Huey Newton out in San Francisco, Angela Davis, the Association of Black Social Workers. We were very provocative in those days. Ron Turanga, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Muhammad Ali. For us, Coleman Young. And then as a lot of our people got involved and got harassed by the FBI, I know many of our people, including some of our Black social workers, didn't escape to Cuba. Cuba was the place that people were accepted to hide out from the government when we got, as they say, too radical. One of the things that came
Mr. Hubbard.
Yes.
We're gonna flip it a little bit. I want to hear. I'm gonna give Victoria a second. I don't mean to cut you off, but we are on a time crunch, and so I want to flip it for a second to hear Victoria and how the law works specifically with helping Black folks. Like the information that you're giving us is great, but we want to build on that. I want to
return to what the programs that New Detroit implemented after you get through with her.
Okay. Thank you, sir. All right, Victoria.
Thanks so much. As Dr. Kubiak has mentioned, I am not only a candidate for Wayne County prosecutor, but I've spent my career on the ground, on the front lines, as a criminal defense attorney. And in particular, I have spent a lot of time working with activists and organizers and advocates of our people who are incarcerated, our people who are dealing with police brutality and racial injustice and social injustice. And I can tell you that if the law was fair to all people, we would not have this national uprising, this international uprising. There's a saying that I got from a prosecutor down in Florida several months ago when I met with her, a progressive prosecutor. And she said to me that there are two types of prosecutors, one who glorifies the law and one who glorifies justice. And that history has shown us that they cannot coexist. Because at one point in time, the law said that it was just and fair to own Black people. At one point in time, the law said that it was just and fair to not consider Black people a full person, to consider them property, right? And we have over time realized that that is not just, and we have changed the law so that we can align justice, or align the law with what real justice is. And so, you know, when you look at history, and history will give us our roadmap, we find ourselves in this peculiar spot and position of asking, where are we going now? What are we learning and what are we doing? Our laws clearly are not just as we sit here in this moment, because we have laws that allow militarized police to brutalize communities, to terrorize communities, to allow people to be inserted into this machine that we call the criminal justice system, which I argue should be called the criminal injustice system, or at the very least, the criminal punishment system, because there's nothing just about it. And then we have a system of laws that says, once you enter the criminal justice system, the 13th Amendment can declare you to be a slave, essentially. And when you do something that's wrong and you go into the system and enter a prison cell, that you have reverted back to being a slave and to being property of the state. And so we are at a moment where we are upon what I call this precipitous of change. And we have to realize that we have never reckoned with our violent beginnings in this country. This country, they violently took Black people from our African homeland. They violently shoved Black people into the bottom of ships and dropped over 2 million people overboard in the water like dead fish. We have a country who has prided itself on bringing Black people to this land and forcing labor for economic growth that Black people still in 2020 can't benefit from. The economic labor that we were forced into, it has manifested in 2019 in the Detroit budget, where a little less than $3 million was spent on law enforcement and policing, and the least amount of money that our city government spent was on health. How did we see that playing out during a pandemic here in the last few months? Those are the decisions that we've made. So we have not learned very much. We haven't come very far, despite what folks may want to tell you, despite the fact that police officers are currently taking knees. Where were those knees when knees were on George Floyd's neck? Where were those knees when Colin Kaepernick was taking a knee and taking a stance against police brutality and he was shunned? That's what we need to come to the table and start the conversation with, that this country was founded on violence, not just any violence, brutal violence, violence against a group of people simply because of the way they looked. We can see that from when this land was initially occupied by outsiders and settlers. We can see that the devastation that took place in indigenous communities was violent, right? This country has this fascination with violence, with forced labor, with slavery, with this racial imbalance that perpetuates and almost makes the violence okay. And that's something that no one in our country in power, in a leadership role, has yet to say, we need to atone for that. We need to atone for our sins, and there must be a reckoning, because a country that was founded on racism will also be the country that's destroyed by racism. And I mean that literally and figuratively. When we look at what's happening across our nations, we have seen buildings burn. Has this been the first time that we've seen buildings burn? Absolutely not. I implore you to look at history and to look at the history of Black communities that were thriving, that were seen as a threat to the majority of folks in this country. And then you'll also find that they were burned to the ground and parks were put on top of them. Freeways were built on top of them. And so this violence that continues, we've learned it from the folks who built this country. And we need to understand that if we're going to do something different, the conversation should not be on the response. That the conversation can't focus on, hey, please protest violently. Yes, you have a First Amendment right to protest, but please do so violently. The conversation should be, please peacefully arrest people. please peacefully hold people accountable if they're doing something wrong, but don't kill them. Don't murder them, because how is that peaceful? That is perpetuating the same violence that this country started and began 400 years ago. And then I ask you to ask yourself and to ask others, how far have we come? In 14 years, we have marched, we've had Dr. King, we have had rally after rally, we have had phone calls and meetings with the top leaders of our nation. And how far have we come in 400 years? And the reason why we haven't come that far is because we have never had that conversation of America acknowledging and embracing its very racist beginnings, and then asking, how do we not reform? You can't reform something that is broken to pieces, right? You have to dismantle it. You have to build something that works for all people. And my call to action to all 177 of you on this call is to not get jammed into this corner of saying you have to pick, if it's just moving forward by voting folks out of office, or if we move forward by taking to the streets and protesting with our demands. We need both. We need to have community partnerships and collaborations, folks like Dr. Kubiak, who can say, there are more ways to make this model that we have work other than the current way that it exists. If you want to demilitarize the police, is the answer necessarily defunding right away? Maybe the answer is saying, we don't get there right now. What we have are still, our current police structure that needs to be trained on de-escalation, that needs to be trained on how to deal with human beings and all of the layered trauma that comes with that, especially when you talk about people of color. You have to understand, you have to acknowledge before you can understand the trauma that people of color have endured in this country. And imagine the trauma that our children are enduring. I'm a mother of a 2-year-old, and if I could pay to slow down his growth so that he does not grow up to watch the news of a Black person losing their life at the hands or at the knee of the people that are supposed to protect us, I would. I don't want my child to see that. But every other Black child in America, they have watched for years, because of the technology, Black people being murdered simply for being Black. What do you think that trauma does to our Black children who will grow up to be Black adults and have to encounter the police? How do you think they're going to respond? Do you think they're going to be compliant? Or do you think they're going to be fearful? Do you think that they're going to immediately fear impending death in that moment and run for the hills? And if they do that, there will be more mothers crying that their child was murdered because a police officer shot them and gave the explanation that they could with impunity, because the law says, if you're running from me, I can shoot you. I can do something to stop you from fleeing. We see every day in court as defense attorneys, law enforcement officers providing the explanation that they took the lethal actions that they took, or that they resorted to brutal violence because they were afraid for their lives. We got to unpack that conversation. If you lived in the community, if you worshiped in the community, if you ate in the community, if you walked in the community in which you serve, you wouldn't be afraid. Black people are not a violent people. In fact, I can point to the 400 years of systemic racism and brutal violence that Black people have endured. And I can tell you that if we were a violent people, the conversation would be different. There would be a different history to point to at Black people responding violently to violence. And we don't. We take to the streets and we march. We demand equality. We demand peace. And people join us. I have never been more proud than I have been in the last week watching not just Detroit, not just other cities in Michigan, not folks in Minneapolis, but people around the country, around the world, banding together and saying, enough is enough. You have, I liken it to a pop bottle, the old Coca-Cola narrow bottleneck bottles, the little glass ones. And we have packed in so much into this bottle, and we've gotten to the top of the bottleneck. And we've capped it, and we've shaken it up. And the cap is popped off and it's exploding. But what's beautiful is it's not Black people that are leading that explosion. There are people of all races, of all religions, of all cultures, of all backgrounds saying this is wrong. How much longer will people have to endure this? They feel the pain. I have seen the tears. I have attended these protests and these rallies. I have come to the aid, quite frankly, of more people who don't look like me, who've been arrested at rallies because they are enraged. They are frustrated. They acknowledge white privilege exists. They hate it. They want to do something about it. If it were clothing that they could take off and remove, they would. Because they understand that that does not get us anywhere if they don't acknowledge it, if they don't come to the table and say, I got you, sister. I got you, brother. And that's what I want you all to take away from this in this moment, that this is not a singular movement. This is our movement. This is our moment. We can do something different here. We can build something that we have never had before. We can work together and wage love and not war on a group of people simply because they were born in a certain skin color. We can lead the world on doing what is right for all people and acknowledging that until we are all free, none of us are free. All of our children, not just my Black child, but all of our children are going to endure this trauma. Watching murder play out on television and social media if we don't do something. And then how will you explain that to them? How will you tell them your role in stopping this? Will you say that you sat on a Zoom call and had a discussion? Or will you say that you started there? That someone implores you to do something different? That you took to the streets and you marched with people? That you did a call to action in your own set of demands in your neighborhood, in your church, in your educational circles? What will you tell your child that you did in this moment? That's something that you have to answer to and answer for. That's something that our country has to answer for. And so I implore all of you to think long and hard about your role in this. And there is a place for everyone in this work. I have acknowledged that there are times where it's inappropriate for me as a defense attorney to be on the front lines of a protest. If I know that the protest is likely to end in an uproar with a lot of arrest, as much as I want to be there, my heart is there with the people on the front lines, I have to remind myself that I have a very important role as a lawyer in this movement, as a movement lawyer. And I have to, unfortunately, sometimes sit back and watch the cameras of folks who are there so that I can just wait to get the call. Because I certainly can't help folks if I'm locked up in a jail cell next to them. But make no mistake about it, I'm fully prepared to do that. Because I think sometimes that is also what it requires. I have seen our state, or at the time she was a state rep, but I have seen our current US Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. I've been out on the front lines with her, with the green hat on, with the National Lawyers Guild. And I have phoned the folks and said, oh goodness, they got Rashida, get down here. That's honorable.
All right, Victoria, thank you for sharing. We're gonna switch it now to hear from our third panelist. Santil, can you introduce yourselves a little bit and tell us a little bit who you are, as well as how we can move forward with this? Victoria, we're gonna come back to you shortly after.
Sorry about that.
Oh no, you're fine. I just wanna make sure everyone has an opportunity to speak.
Hello, everyone. Victoria, thank you for your impassioned words and the your emotions could be felt through the screen. So I appreciate everything that you're saying. I know one of the questions that has come up from students is how to have these conversations, which are delicate conversations and important conversations, and how to have them without offending anyone, how to have them. And first of all, let me say that's a part of what you are all learning as a social worker. We're taught how to have difficult conversations with people who are like us and people whose experiences have oftentimes been nothing like ours. So I'll start by saying use what you're learning, use what you have learned, but also it's putting yourselves in the shoes of other people. It's having having that empathy that we want when we are addressing difficult issues. This race in this country, and I think Victoria spoke on this really well, of this country. And whether you are on the side of people of color who've been victimized over and over and over through the years, or if you are somebody who has experienced white privilege, there are folks on both sides who want to do the right thing and want to understand what to do and how to do it, but they don't know what the approach should be. You know, just start by listening. Start by listening with open ears and having honest conversations about what it feels like for you. Victoria spoke of the fear of having a 2-year-old. I don't have any children, but I have nieces and nephews. I had a 14-year-old brother who died due to gun violence. I look at my 18-year-old nephew every day and I fear him driving back and forth from school in Ypsilanti. He's at Eastern Michigan. That fear is real. The anger watching George Floyd, the anger going back to Trayvon Martin, the anger that goes back to our entire lives of watching people we know and people we don't know that look like us be victimized, and then watching the perpetrators get away. It's real. And when you start to have conversations, those feelings that have been suppressed, and as human beings, we're all really good at suppressing our feelings from day to day. It's a survival mechanism. There's no way you can get through your everyday life if you're walking around with your feelings like on the surface. It's just not plausible as human beings. So when you start to see things like an officer who so callously has his knee on a man's neck in a way that you would not restrain a dog, all those feelings that you've suppressed start to resurface. If you're on the other side of it and you see it, you say, what is my part in this? What have I done? What have my ancestors done? I mean, there are all kinds of feelings, and unless on both sides we acknowledge those feelings, and unless we're all willing to have these honest, difficult conversations, the change won't come. And any change that comes will be temporary. So this is a moment, it is a movement, but at the end of the day, we want this to be a lifetime. So we have to make sure that the conversations, our actions, the steps that we're taking right now are steps that will move us forward for a lifetime. And that does include it includes speaking out. It includes taking action in your community. It includes voting. It also includes talking to our children, talking to your friends, your family, your loved ones about what they can and should do differently. It means that we have to teach the generation after us and help them teach the generation after that the right way to see human beings through the lens of not the color of their skin or their race or their background. And that doesn't mean that we don't see color. That's just a lie. It's something that sounds good and people say it, but it's not true. We have to see color and we have to respect our differences. We have to recognize that we all live in a system that has been set up for some to have a privilege that others don't have. When you can walk into a park, break the rules, be called out on it, and then have the audacity to say, how dare you call me out for breaking the rules? I am now going to utilize a system that has been set up to keep you in place. I can't think of anything that speaks more to white privilege than Amy Cooper. That was the perfect example of white privilege. Thank God it did not end up the way George Floyd's situation ended. But when you put those two together, it's a perfect illustration of how systematic racism has been used by so many in this country for so many years. And I would ask you, although this time has been different and we see this movement that is fantastic and it is heartwarming around the country, how many police shootings have we seen on camera? Because now one of the things people talk about is that, well, it's being filmed. Well, how many have we seen on camera and people still walked away? How many have we seen on camera and the actions have still been justified? And I want you to think about, if people are that brutal with cameras rolling, what's happening when the body cameras are turned off? What's happening in dark alleys where people can't see? What tragedies are being placed upon people who are helpless by folks who have been charged with serving and protecting them? So the anger is real, the fear, the frustration is real. But at the end of the day, once we've cried, once we've screamed, once we've processed our anger, we have to work together to move forward. And every major movement in this country has happened when people have come together, whether it's the riots in the 60s that led to the civil rights movement, whether it's the abolitionist movement. None of it has ever happened if it was just the people being victimized, talking about their victimization. So I urge everyone on this phone to talk to everyone you know who is white, black, brown, or purple about the importance of this movement. And we'll all do it differently. Some will march, some will write. They'll write their congressmen and their legislators. Some will go into different aspects of social work. We can all advocate in different ways, but do something. You gotta do something. And continue to take care of yourselves. And the last piece that I want to urge every single person on this phone to do is, in this difficult time where we layer everything that's going on with the coronavirus, with the civil unrest and tragedies we're seeing across our country, we have to make sure that we're taking time to breathe, take care of yourselves and your loved ones, because self-love is so important in the midst of all of this. Thank you for listening, and I'll be here if there are questions.
Thank you so much for your insights, Santiago. So now what we're going to do, Mr. Paul Hubbard, Ms. Victoria, and Ms. Santiago, they all provided some unique insights as to where we currently are, and what they also provided some of their fears about growing up, like, you know, the future, what we need to look forward to. we've had a historical roadmap, essentially, of Black and white relations in America. And it has not always been smooth sailing. We've had rocky paths, but we've always we've always turned the corner in ways that were helpful. And so what we want to do is we have to think about, essentially, we need to hold politicians accountable, right? So as Mr. Hubbard said, we have to hold our politicians accountable. Yes, it's okay to get out and vote, but voting does not stop at just going out on December 3rd, right? It's sending them an email, calling their offices, showing up and saying, hey, there's this issue that's happening around Black lives. There's this issue that's happening in Detroit specifically. There's this issue that's happening nationwide that you all need to address, right? So just voting on November 3rd isn't good enough. It's going that extra step in making sure that our politicians, the ones who we elect, are doing the work that we want them to do. We also have to think about how can we use social workers in a more hands-on approach when working with some of these systematic issues. As Victoria said, we can't just talk about rebuilding the system. We have to think about dismantling it and then rebuilding it, rebranding it, and making sure that we have equity and not just equality. We also have to think about trainings for police officers. You know, how do we talk to them about engaging with individuals who are not just Black, but, you know, treating all individuals equally? And so the fear is real, right? Specifically for Black folks, specifically Black folks who are working with the public, Black men, the fear is real. So that now the question is, for Mr. Hubbard, for Victoria, and for Santil, how do you think that we can help individuals process and deal with their emotions?
Well, one thing is, as social workers and people listening, it's good to have emotion, and you know that's one thing that motivates us to move. But after we get emotional and motivated to move to do things, then in our different agencies and places, we have to start looking at programs and projects. We have to look at programs that will actually help the people that we're working with. We have to look at putting projects together, and that's one of the things that came out of the 1967 riots with New Detroit, and that was bringing corporate people, white people, Hispanics, everybody together to start putting the committees together to develop projects that actually serve the African American and Hispanic communities. And that's something that we need to do. And, you know, after we listen to a few more comments, if there's time left, I'll even go through some of the projects that we put together for police community relations. And actually, I'm taking kids and police officers to camps for this constructive discussions, etc.
Okay. Victoria, how do you help individuals to process their emotions?
I give people the space to be who they are and to feel what they're feeling. I was on a call last night with a well-known activist in Detroit, and he tries to be someone who bridges the gap between the folks on the ground and the folks in the sky. And as he expressed his frustration about the way that some folks were, some of their anger and frustration was manifesting, I had to remind him, and to which he agreed, that this is a moment where we don't get to tell people how to feel. We don't get to tell people how their feelings should manifest in their actions. We need to be very polite and delicate we need to be very patient and delicate with everyone. And that includes people who may not be directly traumatized by racial injustice. You can be traumatized by racial injustice and not be a Black person. You can be traumatized by racial injustice and not be on the front lines, but be sitting at home and watching. And we need to make room for all of those people across the spectrum. There are going to be people who, again, have roles that they want to operate within, and that's okay. And then there are going to be people who will rush to do any and all job just to have some place to channel those feelings. And that's okay. But just as, we have shared already, it can't stop there. So know that you have that space in that moment, and people should be supportive of all at that time. But then we need to keep pushing and keep moving. And we need to turn that into action. We need to demand. I have been saying for the last week since these events went down that our ancestor Frederick Douglass said that power concedes to nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. And we need to look to those words and the history and what has happened before this moment and realize that us expressing our frustrations and our pains and letting the world have a front seat to our trauma, that will be a balm, but it won't bring about change. You have to demand change. And you don't demand change by doing one singular action. You demand change, and you're effective in your demands when you come together and you have everyone at the table, not just your local elected officials, but the people in which they serve in the community, because those closest to the problem are those closest to the solutions, yet furthest from the resources for those solutions. So it's a 3-step process. Feel, let it manifest into something that turns into an action. And then that action, that collaborative action, an organized action, needs to lead you to the ballot box. Because we know that once you have your demands and you make them collaboratively, that you ultimately want those demands to be permanent, as Ms. Jenkins has stated. And those permanent solutions only come about when you marry demands and action with voting.
All right. And Ms. Jenkins, the question remains: how do you help?
Definitely.
How do you help Black folks deal with their emotions, or just people in general deal with their emotions around everything?
Yeah, I do want to start with voting and say, yes, please, everybody vote and hold your politicians accountable. After you vote, show up to their offices, show up by calling, by writing, and be a part of the budget process in your local community during the federal budget process and state budget process, because that's how our government states its priorities. Look at where money is being spent and you'll know what the priority is. So please get involved beyond your voting. But dealing with your emotions, first of all, we have to acknowledge them. We have to know that acknowledge them and know that it's okay to express what we're feeling. And that expression will come in different ways. For some of us, for others, it's crying. For others, it is doing something. You express your emotions. You feel better when you've gotten out and you've done something. So no one knows you better than you know yourself. Find what works for you and find a way to express your emotions in a healthy way. I also want to ask you to find space to allow others to express their emotions. And people who are feeling the same way as you or may have a different viewpoint or be feeling differently about you. Leave space for those differences and find ways. Because once and I do believe that this movement that's happening now will facilitate some change. There will be some changes in legislation. There will be some changes in policies. And once we get past that, we want to see changes in people's hearts and minds, because that's what will carry it through the generations. We thought the Civil Rights Act was a huge win for people of color in this country. But the reason these things continue is because there are still we haven't changed enough hearts and minds. At the end of the day, it's about what people are feeling inside. So let's continue the conversations with diverse audiences so that they'll know what we're experiencing. And we can find things in common to help us cross those barriers.
All right. Thank you so much. I hear a lot about change and communication, conversations, which are really good. So the next question that I have is, how do you help Black folks specifically deal with their insecurities and trust issues with law enforcement? So we're going to first start with Miss Victoria Burton Harris. Like, how do you help Black folks, or Black men, Black women, Black folks in general, and deal with their insecurities and fears when engaging with a police officer?
Well, I don't think that the action should be directed toward Black people to start. The action should be it should be directed toward law enforcement. There's nothing that you can say or do toward the Black community that will magically establish trust in law enforcement. Again, this goes back 400 years, long before us and long before this moment. And so what it's going to require, in my opinion, is for our leadership to engage in the conversation that they are, quite frankly, right now across the nation. And that is engaging in the conversation in this idea of defunding our police. And a lot of folks think that defunding means that we don't have any police. But in reality, what we're seeing is people divesting, meaning that they're dialing back, and instead of spending $300 million a year and letting that be a city's largest expense, cities saying, we're going to take about $150 million away from them. We're going to prohibit riot gear and the federal government from being able to provide equipment for the sole purpose of them being allowed to act as a militarized police force and dish out brutal violence to people of color whenever they feel like that. So you create trust, or you earn trust within the Black community when you direct your actions toward the people who are engaging in the gross misconduct, and that is our law enforcement. When you acknowledge that law enforcement is not helping us to be safer as a community as they currently exist, when you acknowledge that law enforcement is not properly trained to get to the root of the issues, to the trauma that lead people to behave the way that they do, and that they need to dial back and have a social worker attached at the hip, such as we're starting to see with the model that I've learned a lot about through Dr. Kubiak out in Oakland County. We're having more and more of our leaders across the country come and pull up a chair to the table. And some of them are a bit further back. Others have pulled the chair up and they're sitting and they're ready to have it. And not only are they ready to talk, but they're ready to put their money where their mouth is and to divest from what has obviously from the very beginning been a broken system and a police force that has never been built to truly protect and serve. And if you argue that that has been the case, then I would push back and challenge you to tell me, what have they protected? Who have they protected? And who and what have they served? And I can guarantee you, if you study your history, you will not answer that Black people have been protected, that Black people have been served. And so having those conversations and re-examining our definition and redefining what it means to be a safe community, that will earn Black people's trust in the system.
Okay. And Ms. Jenkins, how do you think that we can engage Black folks or help Black folks to address their fears when dealing with police officers?
It's a really interesting question. It made me think about a conversation I had earlier this week, and I've been having, as we all have, lots of conversations around these issues. And in one of those conversations, the talk came up, and we all know the talk for Black people is your talk with your children, often young Black men, about, okay, this is what you do if you're stopped by the police. And as a part of this conversation, a really wealthy white man said, I teach my child the opposite. I teach my son, I taught my son, if trouble goes down, you run toward the police, you call the police. That's what we teach our kids, which was another incident that just highlights the differences in how we have to live our lives. So the talk about dangers, if you're privileged enough, is danger on the internet. It is danger, the danger of drugs, how to protect yourself during sex. For Black families, the danger is the force that has taken an oath to serve and protect. So how do you, and I do believe it starts with the police force. I do believe that they need to be completely reformed. Victoria, I have a difference of opinion. I'm guessing we can talk more and you might move me more in your direction, but I am not there with completely dismantling the system or the police, but completely restructuring, looking at how we are recruiting. What kind of psychological testing are you providing for police officers when these are the kind of officers that you end up with on the force? Although there are lots of well-meaning, my nephew is one, police officers who are out there trying to protect and serve their communities. But we need to talk to our kids. It's real. Until there's real change, we have to continue to talk to our kids, especially boys, about what to do and what not to do. But in George Floyd's case, that didn't do any good. He wasn't resisting, and he still ended up dead. But it's a conversation we have to continue to have. We have to continue. When I had my Youth Violence Prevention Task Force, the police were there regularly so that kids could interact with the police and say, why do you all come up to the car window with a gun if I'm being stopped for running a red light? Or if I'm being stopped because my blinker isn't working, why do you come up to my car with your hand on your gun? The police officers get to tell them what their fears are too. So I think just like interacting with people of different races and backgrounds help us understand each other, interacting with well-meaning police officers who are doing the right things and can be honest about their fears will help as well. But it definitely has to start with changes in policies and restructuring police departments around this country.
Okay. Thank you for that. And Mr. Hubbard, same question. How do you help Black folks address their fears or insecurities with dealing with the police?
Well, one of the things we have to bring police officers into communities and have interaction. But before that happens, what has worked in the past is the police chief has actually had to look at what officers have the right kind of mentality and which officers are racist and has the wrong kind of mentality. And you separate those two groups out. And then once you understand, because many of the Black officers, I have to say, I think have the right mind, right mentality, and they really want to help. Then you bring them into the community. For instance, we set up something called drop-in centers on the east side of Detroit, which wasn't nothing but storefronts, but we put a pool table in there, some checkers, chess, and a few other things, and had the police officers drop in and interact with the youth as they were on their beat. Get churches that are having activities and block clubs that have summer activities. I don't know if they have them this year. And then you have the neighborhood police officers drop in and interact with people. Parent involvement programs in the schools, get police officers there, but you have to have the right police officers that are there, because people can read body language. They can read whether you're just there because your lieutenant told you to be there or whether you're there to help. But there's interaction, and I've always believed that even though people are on opposite sides, there's a common ground somewhere in the middle, and we have to figure out what that common ground is and then have interaction. As I said earlier, going to camp. We took kids, gang members, and police officers to camp. But we had structured debate, and they all left there feeling better about each other. And eventually the police officers were telling me at that time that because of the community interaction, a lot of the kids and community people would pull them aside and say, hey, this robbery's getting ready to go down. Hey, this is getting ready to happen in the neighborhood. And to let the police then be proactive in blocking a lot of the crime that was going on. So, and this is why I said we have to turn our emotions into planning and use our churches, our neighborhood groups, our block clubs, and the different social work agencies that we work in, and put together programs that's going to bring the community and police officers together, the right police officers together, and try to work towards common ground and working together for the betterment of the neighborhood.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, and so I have one more question, and then we're going to turn it over to the gallery for the rest of the people who may have questions. But one of the questions, the final question I have is, what conversations or actions can be done to create lifelong changes? And so we're going to start with Ms. Santel Jenkins. What conversations or actions can be done to create lifelong changes regarding African Americans and police violence?
Well, I think it goes back to something we've talked about. It's those conversations about what my life experiences are that have led me to what I'm feeling versus what your life experiences are that have led you to what you're feeling. Those shared experiences are real. I think they have to be personal, upfront, and up close conversations for most people to take it to heart. When you see people on television, when you hear them on the radio, it's easy to dismiss it as a one-off. When you realize it is your coworker that you've considered a friend, you've been to her house, she's been to your house, or you guys have played golf or basketball together, and now he's talking to you about coming home from a business trip and being pulled over on I-94, ending up in handcuffs in a business suit on the side of the road. And that's a real thing that happened to my husband. It's easy to say, well, George Floyd had a counterfeit dollar, but when it's your church member that you know or you assume is a good, upstanding community member, it's a lot easier for you to stop and go, well, if they did that to Paul, I can imagine that they would do that, to somebody else, because Paul's a good guy. He didn't do anything. Why would the police have him in handcuffs on the side of the road in a suit coming from a business meeting? So I think those kinds of conversations are real. Having the conversation that Victoria just shared, I'm afraid for my son's life growing up in this community. You have to touch hearts to get people to change their minds. So having those real conversations with people we know in every aspect of our lives and encouraging others to do the same, I think will start to change hearts and the way people view even these videos that they see on television and the stories they hear on the news. They start to understand that what you see on the news is not a true reflection of who Black people are.
Okay. Mr. Hubbard, what conversations can be had to create lifelong changes?
I think number one, it has to be positive conversations, and it has to be conversations that keep the pressure on the legislators, because actually laws and all are implemented by legislators. We need to have conversations of common ground, and that's where the community groups, block clubs, churches come in. But we also need to have conversations about, well, did your state rep do this, or did they support this? And as I talked to them once, they said, I remember in Lansing, I asked the Black Caucus once, I said, well, we don't hear much from you guys anymore. Well, it's because Republicans run the legislature. I said, yeah, but the Republicans don't stop you from having press conferences to let the rest of us know what's going wrong and why we need to write certain letters and why we need to make certain phone calls. So again, it's back to conversations of keeping our legislators accountable, but also conversations of how we use our community groups, social work agencies, and churches to put together programs that foster young people, African Americans, Hispanics, working with police officers. The other conversation is actually pushing our police departments to do personality audits. You know, we all have different personalities. Some people are hot-headed, some people are very cool, some people are to the left, some to the right. I mean, that's the way God set up the world, for all of us to be different. Some of us make good social workers and some of us don't. Some of us be good police officers and some of us don't. So those personality audits would kind of show that. And when we have a conversation telling the mayors and the police department, you need to weed out the bad cops and support the good cops and bring them together in the neighborhood, those are the kind of conversations we need to have to keep things going forward for us.
Okay. And Victoria, what conversations or actions can be done to create lifelong changes?
I think what Dr. Hubbard hit on is key, that we need change in our legislature. And that we can look at specific examples of how qualified immunity is used to protect law enforcement officers who take lives unjustly, and provides them with protection to not be held accountable for it. So that's the very first thing that I think that we can do, is rally behind that idea that we need to push to reform this idea of, you know, qualified immunity, just blanket protections for officers who engage in police misconduct. Another thing that we need to do is, I second what Mrs. Jenkins shared earlier, and that is having conversations. I know oftentimes when emotions are high, we are dismissive of conversations because we feel like they don't take us where we want to be, because we've had conversations for 400 years. And I'm guilty of being there myself. If you would have asked me last week to appear here, I may have been so moved by emotion that I would have said, we're not talking anymore. But having an opportunity to dial back and to be reflective and to not be as emotional in the moment, I am back to the center, in saying that all responses are helpful. Having conversations, not necessarily public discourse, but conversations behind closed doors with Uncle Bob at Thanksgiving that has said racist things for years, and you just kind of silently sit there and hold your head down and kind of shirk a bit. No, this Thanksgiving, I want you to tell Uncle Bob, that's inappropriate. And here's why I'm going to tell you why. And here's a solution to an issue, or here's how you should reframe that in your mind. Like, have those uncomfortable conversations within your circles, because I can tell you that Black folks have them all the time, but we don't have, we're not the ones that are the actors here, right? So we can have those conversations, but until those conversations are had within the actor circles, they don't go as far as they could and as far as they should. And so that's the second thing that I think that we need to do. The third thing is, you have conversations, you start to change minds, share stories in those conversations. Stories of Mrs. Jenkins' husband being pulled over. That goes right to the heart, as she said, and that is what gets people to get out of their own way, to put themselves in someone else's shoes and to say, oh my, that is terrible. I can't imagine. No, you can do your best to try, and that should be a part of the conversations that you're having with Uncle Bob. And that needs to, again, go back to eventually the ballot box. Our legislature won't enact the laws that we want if we don't demand that they do that. And we can't demand something if we don't sit at the table and we don't have a mechanism to hold them accountable. And that accountability tool is our vote. That's our voice. That is the loudest way that we can make a demand, the most powerful and impactful way that we can make our demands. So it requires it requires several things to happen all at once: conversations, changes in the laws, but you got to make sure that voting is in there as well, because you don't get the change in the law unless you have the people in office who have the guts to do that and to enforce those policies.
All right, thank you so much. So this brings us to the end of this first discussion, open discussion on community social work in times of crisis. What do we do? How do we address it? Our panelists have provided us with unique insights as to their own perspectives with the law, their perceptions, their feelings, their emotions, their reactions towards everything that has happened up to date. And they've also provided us with some unique steps as to how we can move forward. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to our Dean, Dean Kubiak, for the closing remarks.
Thank you so much. I've been reading the comments as you've been speaking, and people are just very overwhelmed and grateful for the honesty and for the discussion. And I appreciate that all three of you have put your hearts and your heads into this and showed us a vulnerability that is a gift, and I appreciate that. So I want to, in some of the comments, there was a lot of discussion about community policing, social work police models like first responder models, holistic defense models, mobile crisis. And I think that as the Dean of a School of Social Work, it's really important for me that we show up in this space as a school, and in every one of our actions going forward, as we teach students, as we guide them through field placement, and as we model the behavior that's been suggested here today, that we put ourselves on the line, that we create vulnerabilities and spaces to have these difficult conversations. And I want to say to each and every one of you that I am open to being accountable, and I want to be accountable in this space. This is a responsibility, and it's a moment, and I want us as a school to be part of this moment. And I hope that you'll all join me as we incorporate some of the suggestions that we've heard today, and that we grow as a school to fill this moment. So thank you very much for being here today, for signaling how important this is to you, and committing to all moving forward in a way that does create long-lasting change. So thank you very much. And I just want to say that we're going to have on the 25th of June another forum to discuss COVID in the African American community, and I hope you'll join us then. My sincerest thanks to Paul Hubbard and Victoria Burton Harris and Santil Jenkins. Thank you very much for being here and for leading such a thoughtful conversation. Take care, everyone.